Welcome to this session on IP, innovation, and deglobalization. When Bo asked me to take this role on last week, I said, well, you've got the title wrong, because innovation comes first, followed by IP, and then you have deglobalization, which is going on, rather than the re-globalization, which is the theme of this. But one of the good things about SIP Forum is that what you've planned to say is actually changed significantly by what you've just heard. And going around the imagination labs and then in the last session, I think was a very good starting point for what we're going to be talking about now. Because connectivity is the theme of this forum. And the first session was about connectivity. And we also heard the importance of global standards for connectivity, both to be able to operate in all countries, but for cost reasons as well. But I think it's interesting that the deglobalization that we're seeing is actually in the connectivity area, that it's related to semiconductors, to IT, and it's part of the geopolitical war that is going on, rather than anything intrinsic to the sector itself. And as Bo may be implied by the poem, my background is much broader than the IP from IT. It is from biomed, from pharmaceuticals, from agricultural chemicals, from chemicals to automotives. And one of the things I think we need to be exploring in this session is the small war in semiconductors likely to become a larger war, which through IP and its success or failures could damage other sectors as well. So my own background, the last quarter of my career, was with BTG, and that was working with fundamental innovation and research. And their globalization to me was clearly important. Innovation happens faster if there's interconnectedness. People fire off each other, and you can see that in the research sectors at universities as well as the corporate side. And so I've been a strong proponent of globalization from that aspect. But also, it's been an important aspect for corporations as well. Globalization was initially a competitive advantage, then it became a competitive necessity. But the reality today, we're moving away from globalization that we accepted. What could happen? What are the scenarios? Because we live today in a period of great uncertainty. 2 years ago, we wouldn't have thought it likely that we'd have a war in Eastern Europe, that Russia would invade Ukraine. 10 years ago, we wouldn't have thought that we were deglobalizing, that there'd be embargoed chips moving from China to the rest of the world or the other way around. We have the politics in the United States, which is uncertain as well. And in some ways, certainly in the IT sector, the world has begun to fragment. And to deglobalize in a way which we wouldn't have thought feasible a few years ago, and which is potentially very damaging to us all. Now, there may be some benefits to deglobalization. It tends to build more resilience into systems because you have to have multiple sources. And there may be opportunities for companies in that deglobalization part. But what should the balance be? And one of the things I would like the panel to explore is, before we get to the re-globalization, how do we help stop the deglobalization in this particular sector so we don't suffer any damage which can infect other sectors as well? But we have to live with the situation as we find it. It's a complex area and a rapidly changing area, as I think we've all seen. And there are geopolitical and economic aspects to it as well. We have a distinguished panel to articulate the issues which they can see, and to debate them as well, and to suggest ways forward. You have their full CVs on your SIP devices, so I won't go through that, but they may wish to refer to things in their background which help them to talk about this particular area. One of the other things I would like to see here is that I heard a few people saying, well, we must tread carefully, there are political issues between China and the US. I think the SIP forum, if there's any forum, is where we need to bring these things right up front. We saw in the last slide, Huawei, Lenovo, Chinese firms. We had Qualcomm and Ericsson. These are on different sides of the geopolitical issues, but on the same side in the market issues where clearly there's recognition of the need for global standards. So I think we shouldn't tiptoe around the political or geopolitical issues. I think here we need to address them fully, because one of the questions I'd like to ask is, what advice do we have for our policymakers and governments? Because I think we all know that in this forum, we're speaking to people who understand the language that we're speaking. Outside, probably 95% of journalists, 98% of policymakers, and a rather better number of industrialists really don't know what IP is about. So I think we need to be thinking about what policy recommendations would we make to our policymakers and governments. I would like each panelist to address a particular area, the subject of the session, and then to ask Grigor to start from an EU perspective, but particularly standards essential patents, which draws directly from the previous session. Khan to talk about the perspectives from China, Andre from a US perspective, and then Rama will talk both from US perspective and the geopolitical and political issues, IP issues around the emerging area of AI. So, Khan, Grigor, can I ask you to kick off, please?
Sure. Thank you very much, Ian, and thanks to Ericsson for hosting us in this wonderful venue. There are a couple of things that are, I think we should recall or highlight as the backdrop to this debate. First is, we are now pushing the boundary of physics in a number of technologies, in cellular, in chips. The smallest size transistors now are 3 nanometers. The diameter of the coronavirus is 120 nanometers. So that's where we are in terms of chips. We're also pushing the boundary in cellular, as you've heard earlier today, and all this has been possible. Many factors, brilliant researchers and innovators such as Ericsson and many other, but also because we've managed to create these global standards and global markets which allow people to specialize, regions to specialize in different areas and share that knowledge. So today I am sitting here instead of Kirti Gupta, who is the ex-chief economist of Qualcomm, and it's really, I am taking very large shoes, not literally, figuratively speaking. So forgive me if I do not deliver on, if I do not justify that, but I'll do my best. And I'll start with a couple of words about IP and where I see the IP in this context and what's happening right now. So to economists, intellectual property is basically that legal construct which allows the efficient markets to be set up for knowledge. Knowledge, if you want to trade it, you have to reveal it, but if you reveal it, anybody can take it and implement it, so you need the right to exclude the use of this knowledge. And of course, that can work as long as courts are willing to enforce and as long as courts enforce it in a somewhat consistent way across the globe. So IP obviously is also very important for standardization, and that's another big topic that we are discussing today. But in my view, it cannot directly be very effectively used as leverage in a geotech war. And to see that, we can go back in history a little bit. IBM has brought its S360 computer mainframe in '65. That was at the peak of Cold War. It commercialized it in '68. The Soviets had it cloned in '71. A couple of years later, they have sold it, produced it in thousands, and commercialized it. So it really was not, the problem was not IP there. The problem was for the Soviets is that they did not have the software ecosystem because their markets didn't function. And that brings me back to the importance of functioning markets and the rule of law. Now, IP, however, probably in these geotech wars is indirectly important because it allows states, nations, to impose export controls through IP. The real geotech war that we're seeing now is happening right now, mostly in semiconductors. That war is going to be costly for everyone, and it's questionable if we are able to really decouple, because that the ecosystem and the value chain in semiconductors is incredibly complex. An average chip touches 25 countries. 25 countries are involved in the production of an average chip, and it crosses the borders more than 70 times. There are regions which are specialized in different parts of this value chain, but in the Asia-Pacific region, we have 77% or more of all manufacturing capacity, and 100% of manufacturing capacity under 10 nanometers. 92% is in Taiwan, 8% is in South Korea. This is going to be very, very difficult to overcome, reshore. The best we can hope for is to sort of make some minimum level of resilience, but we should not push this system that we have in place too far, because it's going to be incredibly costly for the citizens of the world, I think.
So what advice would you have for policy makers? You've said that it would be extremely costly in terms of the war. Costly for companies, costly for the consumers as well. How would you articulate that to policymakers who are engaged in this war?
To think more than 1 year ahead, to think 5 years ahead, at least, maybe 10. In fact, you know, in order to build a fab, a facility where you manufacture chips, you need 7 years, maybe more, especially when you move to more advanced chips with smaller logic gates. We're not going to be able to do it so fast anyway. And in the meantime, we are, potentially, actually, there is a risk that the cost to European nations, US, is higher than the gain in terms of geostrategic leverage that they get. That is sort of, my concern. And the advice would be to think ahead and engage in a debate. And in fact, to be aware that the real competitive advantages comes from well-functioning markets, democracy, rule of law, which attracts talent. That's where the advantage is. Talent, not technology, not IP, not cheap manufacturing fabs and capacity.
And given the uncertainty that you've highlighted and the ability of our politicians to think 5 or 7 years ahead in the West anyway, what advice would you have for companies operating in this environment?
That's a hard one. Maybe ask me this question at more towards the end of this panel. I'll have a thought.
Khan, the perceptions from China.
Okay, thank you very much. First of all, my first name you can pronounce Tan.
Tan, beg your pardon.
Yeah, so in Chinese we say Tan. So I thank you very much for the invitation, and I want to use this maybe 4 or 5 minutes to talk about 2 points to inform today's discussion. My 2 points, first is about both about policy making in China, because I think if everybody gets a better understanding of policy making in China, you will devise a better strategy for company and a country. And first one is about IP policy making in China. So the highest policy making body in China is Politburo of CPC, the party. And the bureau convene once every month in the end of the month to study one topic. So in the last 10 years, there's only been one time the Politburo in China studied IP topic. That's in the end of 2020, November 2020. In this monthly study event, normally the Politburo will invite an expert to give a lecture, 30 minutes, about a topic, and then the Politburo member will discuss, and then the president or the party secretary, general secretary, will give a speech. So that speech will define the tone, the policy-making tone in China for next 5 or 10 years. Because the topic will not be frequently discussed. There are so many issues to study, to discuss, but only one issue, 1 month, 12 issues a year. So in 2020, November, the topic about IP policy in China, President Xi Jinping gave a speech and set a tone for the China of IP policy in the next 5 or 10 years. So the tone is to China will strengthen protection of IP, period. 1 year later, Chinese State Council and the Central Committee of CPC unveiled a national IP development strategy for 2021 to 2035. That's concrete work plan for China in terms of IP issues for next 15 years. Because that's highest level of policy drafting body, State Council and the Central Committee. So then everybody studied that document. That's publicly available. And we studied that as well. So that basically just continued the measure to China will strengthen protecting IP. Okay, so that's my first point. The second point is about the innovation policy. So many of you know that the current Chinese policy is very much in the making since China opened up from 1979. After 1979, there were two schools of thoughts competing with each other how China will make innovations. One school thoughts, let's open up, buy. Because China is so lag behind, the status was so low in 1979, so the outside technology is so superior, and the rational strategy for the country and company is to import technologies. But the other schools thought is that we have to make ourselves, right? Because if you buy, you cannot have capacity to further develop. You don't know the know-how, you don't know trade secrets, you end up rely on others. But these two schools has competing with each other along the 40 years. And the results that you look at large aircraft, high-speed train, automobile, in these critical and large sectors, the buy schools won all the time. So China had a large aircraft program in 1980s and abandoned. China developed its a high-speed railway and projects, but later collaborated with German and Japanese and French and companies. And automobile, China welcomed all major automobile manufacturers to China invest and make joint venture with Chinese company. But after 40 years, only in the last 3 to 5 years, China's company have developed its indigenous technologies, but mostly in electric vehicles, not in combustion engine cars. So all of this by school won until the trade war broke out. The trade war broke out. There were first Huawei in the entity list, and now there were 700 companies in the entity list. And this made the country debate what we choose, what we go forward, make or buy. A consensus has been reached in the parties' 19th Central Committee, 19th Party's National Congress, 5th Plenum, 2020. The resolution from that plenary meeting is that China will put science, technology, self-reliance as the core of the country's development. That will govern China's policy for next 10 years, at least next 10 years. Because if you are familiar with China's policy making, you know China's policy making has a good continuity, but also flexibility. But in these critical issues topic, continuity is very important. So I will stop here, just give you 2 points to inform today's discussion.
Maybe I just follow up with one question. You referred to a trade war. Seen from the Chinese side, do you see it as a trade war where espionage, IP theft is used as an excuse, real or imagined? Or do you see it as a real trade war? What do you see as the origins of the trade war from the Chinese side?
From many Chinese, we don't believe espionage is an issue. we believe that the right for development is an issue. So Chinese want to develop, and nobody wants to be dragged behind. And that's fundamental thing, I think.
Great. Thank you very much. I mean, just a comment from my perception, having been going to China a lot since 2004. I ran a course at Tsinghua University for 10 years. I mean, what was interesting for me is that intellectual property was the first ownership right given to people after 1977. That people couldn't own property. Intellectual property was the first thing that they were allowed to own. And then Wen Jiabao, in I think the 1990s, said competition of the future is going to be competition in IP. And we were talking about the ability to plan long term. The 20-year program for IP development in China in 5-year segments, one of them is for education. Education about IP in China starts at age 5. I have the cartoon books for teaching patents and copyright for the 7- and 8-year-olds in the city of Tianjin. And I've listened to a debate in Shanghai between 12-year-old school children, which would have done justice to a master's degree course here. So you have to understand that IP is very firmly embedded in China. So, from China, Andre, perspective from the US, please.
Great. Thanks, Ian. Great to be with all the co-panelists and everybody here. Thanks to Ericsson for hosting us. Bo for putting us together, bringing us together. It's fantastic. What I'm about to say is going to sound shocking to everyone. There are a few differences between China and the United States. One difference is that, listening to Tan, you said? Tan, that they are able to have a planning meeting. A planning meeting. Think about that. And not just that, come up with a policy resolution after that, and then have 5-year, 10-year, 20-year plans that they can execute on. What remarkable concepts. We have to be very mindful that in the United States and in the West to a large extent, but I'm just going to focus on the US, there is no such ability. And for better or worse, we are a free market economy, very decentralized, where we end with a government that on purpose is effectively decapitated every 4 years or 8 years, and you have to start from scratch. Actually, very often, you don't even start from scratch. You spend the first year or two of any new administration working to undo what the prior administration did just because it was the prior administration. And then you start again and you focus on what you can achieve during your term, and then folks think about the next election and so on. And that's only at the administration presidential level. Layer on top of this the fact that we have a divided government, and you have a Congress that is not often aligned with the administration. The Congress within itself is divided. And then layer on top of this, you have independent courts that often undo everything that government has done. So that creates an issue for assets that are naturally meant to be long-term. And IP, more than almost anything else, is an asset that is meant to be long-term. It's a forward-looking asset. We invent now, we protect it now, but the technology will only develop after this act of innovation, and we give 20-year rights, and we really don't know what's going to happen. And many things peter out, and we don't get to market them. Other things become huge successes. And how are you able to predict not just the economics, but the rule of law, the legal regime becomes very important. And this is the fundamental challenge in the West and especially in the United States. How do you, as a business, make long-term plans when your main asset is subject to laws and regulations that change every few years and very often in unpredictable ways. It is remarkable to hear, Ian, that the first right of ownership in China in the late 70s was the IP right. And I'll remind folks that in the United States, intellectual property is the only right actually spelled out in the body of the Constitution that was adopted in the 18th century. The word right appears in the Constitution of the United States, in the body itself, only once. And it's in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 8, with respect to patents and copyrights. The founders of the United States recognized at the end of the 1700s that this is the most important economic right that needs to be spelled out in order for it to be implemented. In today's world, people have lost, at least in the West, at least in the United States, have lost focus on that. They've lost the understanding of what it means to have an intellectual property right. And the main thing they have lost focus on is that it is actually a property right. They say IP left and right without even knowing what the two letters stand for. And then for the more educated ones who actually know that IP stands for intellectual property, they don't really ascribe the meaning of property to the word property in IP. So one of the first things that I think is really important upon governments to understand, since you're asking what advice I would have for governments, the most fundamental thing is, remember it is a property right and treat it as such. And then on top of that, of course, you have to understand it's a long-term property right, it's a planning right. And you have to be able to plan around it. The second thing that you have to understand is that in addition to being property, it is currency. IP is the currency of innovation. It enables the innovation in the first place. And then it enables the transfer of innovation between entities, between innovator and implementer, between innovators with other innovators to collaborate with each other. It's the currency of innovation. And if you don't have reliable rule of law, in order to be able to understand what your rights are, you have effectively eliminated the ability to trade in it and obviously to be able to invest in it. Think about the dollar bill. If you cannot predict what the dollar bill will be and will have wide variation in value from one administration to another, from one Congress to another, how can you possibly invest? How can you possibly trade with it? And on the point of globalization, and then I'll stop talking and wait for the others. On the point of globalization, a really important thing to understand for both governments and companies is that what a universal understanding of IP rights will do is to enable that globalization. In other words, if countries around the world have at least the same understanding and implementation of IP rights, it will enable companies to enter other jurisdictions and do business there, feeling secure and comfortable that their IP rights will be respected under the rule of law of those other countries. So it enables globalization. So it was really important in the 90s, as the West was contemplating China's entrance into the WTO, for example, at the end of the 90s. It was really important to make sure along the way that IP rights will be respected there. And that is the same vis-a-vis all other countries where we want our businesses to enter and do business. If the rule of law breaks down, if IP rights are weakened in one particular country versus another, or globally, that will result in deglobalization, because, or at least it will be an incentive towards deglobalization, because then private companies will feel less secure in investments in those jurisdictions. So you want to avoid deglobalization, and you want to enhance further globalization, then you have to enhance intellectual property rights and the common understanding of those rights around the world.
That's a pretty full description of what we need to have. As former director of the US PTO, what advice would you give to the US government, which has put these trade embargoes in place?
Well, so first of all, my first piece of advice is what I've already mentioned. Understand that IP is a property right, and it's the basic rule of law that businesses have to rely on in order to conduct the business of innovation and the trade in that innovation. To be specific, to answer your question more specifically, do not go around the world working to weaken IP rights. If anything, either say nothing or go around the world like it used to be in the past and work with foreign governments to increase the strength of IP rights. I'll give you a very specific example. It doesn't relate to the tech industry right this minute, but the very specific example that relates to the waiver of patent rights when it comes to COVID-19 vaccines and the suspension of the TRIPS agreement with respect to COVID-19 vaccines. That alone, what that does, so by the way, it was not going to happen until the US administration signaled to the governments around the world that the US is in favor of this happening at this moment in time. So if you extrapolate that beyond COVID-19, which is, a historic health crisis, but if you extrapolate beyond that, and if this were to be potentially implemented in other areas, clean energy, for example, climate change. Already the head of the WTO said that we should do similar things for climate change technologies. And you can think about that with respect to lots of other technologies that a government or another will deem as being life-threatening or life-saving. If companies cannot rely on the rule of law with respect to their patents, and we're going to go around and suspend them or enable countries to suspend them, that will result in deglobalization, less international trade. So that's my first piece of advice. Work really hard to convince governments around the world to strengthen their IP rights, not to suspend them.
Thank you very much. And talking about emerging technologies, we now move on to AI. Rama, would you like to talk about that?
Thank you, and thank you, Sitforum. Thank you, Bo. Thank you, Ericsson, for having me here today. I'm the Senior Director at the Special Competitive Studies Project, where I work on societal implications of AI and IP policy. SCSP was created in October of 2021 as a nonprofit, non-partisan initiative. It grew out of the congressionally mandated National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence, where I worked on ethics and responsible AI, as well as IP policy. The mandate for the National Security Commission on AI was looking at methods and means necessary to advance AI and associated technologies at the intersection of AI and national security. I was detailed there from the United States Patent and Trademark Office with thanks to my co-panelists to approve that detail. And the SCSP expands the work of the NSCAI. Its mission is to make recommendations to strengthen the United States competitiveness where AI and other emerging technologies are reshaping national security, economy, and society. There's no question that the United States is in a strategic competition with the People's Republic of China and in a race to lead in technology. The nations that lead in the technology competition will reap the benefit of these technologies like generative AI for our national security, economy, and societies. And we at SCSP believe generative AI provides the golden moment for US leadership. Last month, we issued a report entitled Generative AI, the Future of Innovation Power. And this report provides a comprehensive assessment of Gen AI's promises, as well as the conceivable peril of this fast-evolving technology, and includes a series of recommendations with policy recommendations to senior U.S. government officials, and that is the perspective of my remarks. Our foreign policy memo addresses the dual challenge of geopolitical competition with a systemic rival, meaning the PRC, and the wide-ranging impact of emerging technologies on global security and economic prosperity. We have three broad recommendations for how the U.S. can position itself for global leadership in generative AI. The first recommendation is to develop and implement what we call platforms, statecraft, as an integrated strategic effort in concert with allies and partners. We have to build the global tech platforms that underpin advantages in generative AI and other strategic technologies according to our values. Just as in the past, when nations competed for access to coal, steel, and other inputs to the physical world, it is now reality with inputs to the digital world. And platforms include hardware, software, and other dimensions of the tech stack. So concrete examples include telecommunications infrastructure like cell towers, to digital networks like smart cities and digital payments, to software applications, to standards, including regulations. The second recommendation is to adopt new tools to capitalize on the transformative power of generative AI to unlock those capabilities across the U.S. government and agencies, so we can remain at the cutting edge in leveraging the technology to execute and achieve our missions. Generative AI tools will accelerate and augment the United States government's workforce, as well as help us capitalize on our wealth of existing data. For example, using large language models to parse through the fine details of the past 80 years of diplomatic relationships to bring new relationships and leverage new tools in our State Department. And the last recommendation focuses on crafting global frameworks for managing generative AI by designing and organizing international regimes, institutions, and dialogues to mitigate against the most highly consequential AI use cases and support, importantly, the positive applications of AI. International cooperation on generative AI, it requires the same level of action and urgency as we saw during the nuclear era in the 1940s and 50s when actors organized to mitigate this threat. And we propose 3 international fora to mitigate against global AI problems at scale. The first one is a global AI security forum. We need a new leaders council similar to the UN Security Council to manage the highest consequential AI use cases that can allow leaders to work through the issues and define, place, and ensure guardrails around the development and use to mitigate risks. Second is United States PRC dialogues. The United States and the PRC should bilaterally address generative AI to preserve its strategic stability around the highest consequential risks. And as the US and China lead in AI development, the prospects of AI impacts will necessitate a substantive foreign policy dialogue to ensure global peace and stability. And lastly is a like-minded forum to advance the DemTech vision. This vision encompasses how technology can be empowered for democracies. The US government must work with its partners and allies to jointly innovate, commercialize, align governance, and build global DemTech platforms. If the generative AI moment has taught us anything, it's that the US must lead alongside allies and partners to build a DemTech agenda for the future. And I think this will be the essence of securing our innovation power.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I think it was the third point you made was creating the need for US PRC dialogue in this area. How do you see that happening? What kind of venue or venues should it take place in? And do you see receptivity for this from the US government?
Well, certainly, as I mentioned, we have historic examples of this with the Soviet Union. Even in the midst of a Cold War, there were high-level dialogues. And I think we certainly need to have those here when it comes to existential risks, either created by AI or that AI can solve. And so I think those dialogues are necessary for, again, for peace and stability.
Do you see this happening yet? Is there receptivity in different parts of the US government, or which parts of the US government do you think this should stem from?
Well, Secretary Blinken certainly just made a recent visit. So I think there are certainly touch points, and we'll see what the future brings.
Thank you very much for that. Maybe you can be thinking about your own questions. I have a couple of questions for the panel, particularly for Andre and Tan. And it relates to the starting point for the trade war. It was the US who embargoed some goods coming in and embargoed some goods going out to China. What will happen, Andre, when Huawei tries to enforce its patents in the United States, or Qualcomm tries to stop Huawei using its technologies in China because they want to stop them because they aren't allowed to license by the US government? What do you see the issues there?
Well, first of all, I'm hoping your premise is wrong. I'm hoping that we don't get to a place where countries, say that you cannot enforce, the patent owner cannot enforce their patents depending on the country of origin of that patent owner. One of the most important things about patent laws is that they are non-discriminatory, both with respect to technology, but also with respect to the country of origin and the identification of the patent owner. Unfortunately, however, there is a certain pressure in the United States to create potential laws that might make it more difficult in some cases to enforce certain patents. So there is some pressure, for example, to pass some legislation that says that if a company is on an entity list in the United States, then potentially that company cannot enforce its patents in the United States. I think that would be a big mistake. Obviously, once you do that, then the other side can retaliate in a similar fashion, and the overall system breaks down. One of the greatest achievements in the world of IP is the TRIPS agreement, which is an international agreement that spells out minimum standards for IP laws in a particular country to be able to trade and to be able to be a member of the WTO. And there's wide acceptance of the TRIPS agreement. It was passed in the early 1990s, and it played a huge role in with respect to globalization and international trade. If we walk away from that, then the system breaks down. And a good example, since for what somehow the Soviet Union keeps coming up on this panel, but you might recall when, and I come from Romania, which was communist back then, and you might recall that the currencies did not match at all. You could not use, if you came out from Russia with rubles or from Romania with the Romanian leu back during communism, that wouldn't do you any good here in the United States, and therefore the trade between those blocks was almost nil, almost. And if you balkanize the IP system, very similar things will happen to the innovation economy. There's a second danger in the United States, which goes the other way. There are some who are arguing that we should not grant patents. So the first point was about enforcing existing patents. The second point is about granting patents on certain areas of technology for the fear that once you publish a patent application, which provides a public disclosure by definition, others around the world could copy it. So there is some talk about, let's identify critical areas of technology. Maybe it is AI, maybe it is quantum, whatever it might be. And there should be stricter restrictions. There should be certain restrictions on on what types of patents we grant or how we publish them and the like, in the fear of, once we do that, some countries might just copy it and not pay attention to the patent system and the rule of law. Now, I don't think either one of these will advance, will go very far for many reasons, but I think people should be mindful of these potential dangers. Dangers in my view. Others think that they're, some people think that that's a good idea, but I don't.
I would certainly see it as a danger if that proposed law were to pass, even though I think you said it has a very, very small chance of passing. My view would be that it would be a disaster for the world's IP system. But there is some history for this, because the CDMA patents weren't published when they were invented in the mid-1940s because they were used for military purposes. So there is some historical precedent. Even though they are wartime patents, we are in a commercial war.
Yeah, well, so first of all, the law that you're referring to is still on the books. So there are certain patents that go to national security and military technology that do not get the license to be published, but there are very, very few that qualify. There is a particular unit at the USPTO. I've never met them. I don't even know where they were housed, frankly, but it exists. And they review these, and I'm not sure what happens to them, but the concept that they're super secret. But the concept that we would expand that to something that someone considers to be economic warfare is very dangerous, because you get on the slippery slope, and again, you end up in the same place we just discussed, and it's a breakdown of the international IP regime.
Thank you. Tan, how do you see this from the other side of the Pacific?
Yeah, so I can offer the China perspective. So I think the IP is very soft in the tech war. So what we are talking about is entity list.
So what do you mean by soft?
I mean, Huawei was sued by Cisco in 2003. That's okay. And that's a wake-up call for Huawei. When you go internationalize, you have to respect other companies' IP. And we teach these cases to our MBA students, EMBA students. If your company go abroad, you should respect the others' IP, otherwise you have end up in litigations. So then what Huawei did afterwards is pay the royalty to other right holders. But now in the tech war, it's not these tactics, right? You cannot stop Huawei by IP. Huawei has a very strong IP portfolio. So now the tools is used, is entity list. No matter what reason, nobody can sell component to you. That's much stronger than IP. So I think from China perspective, if you play by IP, that's fine. China respect IP. Let's play with IP. But now it's not play with IP. It's play with entity list. That's a tool we haven't seen in this scale in the world. Has not been such number of companies were put in entity list, 700, including universities and public research organizations. They cannot get any components with US technologies. That's a tool has not been used in history.
So, Andre.
Just very quickly, there's certain actions or inactions that governments around the world can take that have counter reactions and sometimes ineffective and damages counter reactions. But it's very important to be aware of the action or inaction in the first place that's causing the counter reaction. It's important to be aware of it so that you can address it and hopefully avoid the unintended consequences of the counter reaction. So, to be frank, there's a huge counterfeiting problem around the world. And according to the OECD, something like 85% of counterfeit goods in international commerce still to this day comes from China and its territories. That causes public servants in the United States to be pressured to do something about that. And it's the something that's done, it's not always effective and sometimes has unintended consequences. But because there's this political pressure to do something, they're stealing our stuff, in quotes, okay? You have to do something. Politicians come up with some of these ideas that, that may or may not be very effective. Look, I do think that through trade agreements or otherwise, I think if counterfeiting and other perceived or real theft of IP is dramatically reduced, I think that will take the pressure away from embargoes or some of these more extreme IP proposals.
Thank you. Now,
Yeah, just a quick comment. So I agree with both with Andre and Chan that IP is probably not going to be the war on IP front is probably not going to escalate quite as fast or at all as it did in chips. And that's because, you know, if you pressure the other side far enough, it can just look up the knowledge that's there and implement it and ignore it. That's a little bit different with chips, for example, or other key technologies. That's harder. So it's used indirectly, and it will be used in the future indirectly to exclude some nations or put them on entity lists and enforce those entity lists, but not directly, like, you know, not enforcing Huawei's patents in US or vice versa.
thank you very much. Can I open the floor to questions or comments or debate, please? Who would like to follow up these interesting, complex, and potentially dangerous issues, even though we hope the probability of them happening is low?
You can ask a question.
Sorry, there's...
If you don't like it, then we'll edit it.
Yes. There should be a microphone coming to you, and if you can identify yourself with your question, either to the panel as a whole or to an individual, please.
Hi, so Suzanne Harrison, I guess it's to Andre and Tan. I'm curious, if you were to put your prediction hats on, what do you think are some possible scenarios of what this looks like 5 years from now? US and China relations.
Look, I'm very optimistic. I think things will move in ultimately at, you know, directionally, it will go in a positive direction when it comes to IP and the innovation understanding between China and the United States and the rest of the world. I think, for example, I believe that from the outside, I can see what Tan is talking about. We see it here. There is definitely a focus on IP and innovation in China. I think it's moving in the right direction in terms of improving their regimes and the respect for IP. I think in the United States, despite the ups and downs here as well, we are moving in the right direction with respect to IP. But again, I emphasize both places, there are significant ups and downs. I think the two countries and the rest of the world as well will continue to focus on the real thing, which is innovation. Let's not forget, IP is a tool. It's a very important tool, but it's just a tool. It's not the end, it's just the means. Ultimately, we want innovation, we want more and more innovation, and we want innovation that benefits the economy, grows the economy, and benefits ultimately people. So I think there's, you know, again, despite ups and downs, I think, you know, the countries will continue to just focus on that and adjust their systems to ensure they maximize their domestic innovation. And the competition will continue to exist. Robust competition will continue to exist on innovating the technologies of the future. And I think we're at the beginning of that, right? So there is going to be an innovation war. I don't know if war is the right term. Maybe an innovation race is probably better, where the countries are trying to outdo each other. And that's great. It's great. It's great for humanity. The more competition there is in the innovation space, the better, because you come up with more and more things. And countries around the world, and I'll speak for the United States, we need to do everything we can to maximize our innovation output in our countries and those who are aligned with us. And that's where, in the end, I see this going. And the IP will self-adjust along the way, in my view.
If I can be very pointed, you've expressed a hope. But to answer Suzanne's question, if you were to look 5 years ahead, do you actually think that there'll be a rapprochement between the US and China so that the embargoes certainly go no further, but might be lifted?
Yeah, look, I do think it will move towards that direction. I don't know if in 5 years they will go away completely or not. I think it will move in that direction. Why? It's because of what I said in my previous answer, which is I do think as China becomes more and more innovation and IP-centric, the more they say what Tan says, that it's important to respect IP, the more confidence both industry and governments in the West will have in that system and being able to interact with that system. And in the end, you'll end up with continuing innovation competition, but without the trade war type of overlays.
Fingers crossed. Tom.
Yeah, so I agree with Andre's optimistic view. So I'm even more optimistic. I think in 5 years' time, the tech war will diminish. Because in 5 years' time, China will produce a massive number of semiconductor products. And there's no way to further embargo, because China has. And also there's a pressure for US large companies, their bottom line. They need to sell to China. China is the largest producer of end products. That's why China imports $200 billion chips every year, more than oil and gas China imported. So that's a symbiotic relationship between China and the United States. People call it Chimerica, Neil Ferguson. The two countries marry together. But now you want to separate. It's hard. It's caused bad feeling. And the relationship work well. So when the policy was announced, in Chinese, we don't understand why there's this policy. It's not good for China, definitely, but also not good for the US. Because you create a market for Chinese domestic industry. Otherwise, they have not the opportunity. Because the level is so low, they will not, Chinese buyer, they will not buy for domestic chips. The quality is so low. But now if you don't ship, they have to buy, they have to help them. The ecosystem is emerging. In 3 to 5 years' time, there will be massive number of production coming out. And then there's no point to further embargo, and there's no point, in my view, to go to other sector to repeat the same thing. No point. So I think the two countries will kind of better innovate together.
Right. And Gregor, from the middle, literally and metaphorically, would you agree with those points?
So look, it's bad for China, it's bad for US, but it's even worse for Europe, I think. We're in the middle. We're small, lagging behind in many dimensions, with some notable exceptions, Ericsson and so on. But we are being held a bit hostage in this game. I am with Kan on the fact that China will overcome these problems that they have now in really small, on high-end chips, and that will kind of be a wake-up call for other Western nations, that this is not really going in the right direction, and that actually the better way to get the leverage, geostrategic leverage, is to be open in trade, open in terms of freedoms, have a strong rule of law, because that's what attracts talent. And that's where the real, I think, competitive advantage and the real game is going to have to be played. Because as I said before, IP, it's even easier to steal, copy, if you push someone, than it is, for example, to build a semiconductor plant. It takes 7 years. But IP, even in the time of Cold War, where the borders were hermetically sealed, it was, taken up by the Soviets, coming back again in a couple of years. A perfect clone of IBM S360 mainframe. What they didn't have is markets.
How do you
rule of
think
law.
the EU can best influence the two sides towards the outcome which we'd all like to see?
So before you ask me what would be the advice for the companies,
Yes.
and so I listened to the other panelists, and my advice would be go and speak to your governments and be direct. I don't think you can do much. It's going to have to be the companies in China, in the US, and people like Andre that advocate for not to break the system, to be careful with it.
Andre, do you hear companies saying that out and loud?
Yes, not enough. But I have an idea, Gregor, for what the EU could do. They can begin with not implementing anti-IP regulations, such as this royalty board they want to do with respect to standard essential patents. Because if there is this pressure within the West to weaken IP laws, that snowballs, and that applies pressure in the United States. Now we're going to have this, and it really creates this rift, further rift between the West and China and so on. So I do want to say, something that I think is important when it comes to to what Tan mentioned with respect to semiconductors. It's a two-edged sword that people have to be very careful about. China will do what it's obviously in its national interest, as every country does. As Tan mentioned, they're beginning to become massive producers and will be massive producers of semiconductor chips. They're already massive producers of other technologies. They're already a leading player when it comes to telecom, for example, AI development, and the like. Okay? That, however, doesn't necessarily mean that the countries will continue to collaborate. It could go the other. It could. That would be great. But it could go the other way as well. It could lead to fragmentation and decoupling, especially when it comes to standards and the like. As long as the US has capability and then China has its own capability, if there is no collaboration and no incentives to collaborate, well, then they'll do the only other thing that's possible for them to advance their national interests is to advance their own approach to things. And that would be bad overall for everybody, especially when it comes to the advancement of standards and the public good. So I think companies need to continue to talk to their partners and peers overseas. And as Gregor mentioned, they need to do much more, especially in the West, to talk to their governments and make their governments understand why it's really important to have a robust IP regime that enables trade, not a regime that drives towards fragmentation.
Tan, sorry.
I just wanted to build upon the point that Andre made, that and observe that globalization is not necessarily in retreat. I mean, last year, the two-way trade between U.S. and China was at its highest with over $650 billion. So this binary distinction between unfettered global trade and national protectionism is really misleading. De-risking has advantages of not putting a nation in a vulnerable position because of interdependencies. Look at what happened to the US during the pandemic when we could not produce PPE, or personal protection equipment. And look what's happening with oil here in Europe and its dependency. Another added benefit is that moving production closer to innovation geographically also helps with innovation. I mean, look at Tesla, which is a vertically integrated company that keeps its supply chain internally. It makes it a very innovative company. and it is resilient to supply chain disruptions.
Tan, just one quick question following on from what Andre said. Do you think the Chinese government, because it takes probably a greater role than the EU governments or the US, will it be prepared to make the necessary compromises, commercial compromises, to have the common standards that we're talking about?
Yeah, I think so. I think so. Well, I mean, I agree with Andrea. So there's a possibility that if China, US has the similar capacity, they can start their own camp, own standards. There will be fragmentation. But I think it's also China's interest to have the global standard. And 5G, global standard, China benefit a lot until trade war. So China definitely wants to have that model going on, move forward. It's China's interest.
Thank you very much. I think we have time for one more question from the floor. Yes.
Dan McCurdy from RPX. This is for Rama. So in March of this year, in the middle of one of our executive committee meetings, it started off with 3 or 4 of our executives talking about Chat GPT. And I said, what is that? Now remember, that was 6 months ago. And the question that I have for you is, the first concept of AI was introduced in 1938. AI was actually created in the early 50s. In 1968, 2001, HAL, IBM, right, was released in 1968. And then suddenly, in a period of 6 months, unless I was just completely asleep, it suddenly has become a national, worldwide emergency that requires the same kind of controls that nuclear weaponry have. And I want to truly understand, how did either the world not see something that's been going on for 70 years, or is there an overreaction that is going on? What's your view?
Yes and no. I'm a lawyer. So I think one of the best things that's come out of ChatGPT is that it brought AI to the masses. I've been talking about artificial intelligence since 2019 with the National Security Commission on AI, and nobody really knew what AI was, what its implications were. And so now the average person plays around with ChatGPT or other large language models, and they see some of the capabilities. So I think that's really brought it to the main discourse and starting debates that we really need to have about, for example, copyright issues and who owns copyrights. I think that AI, the transformative potential is real, especially when AI converges with other fields like biotechnology, education, healthcare, and AI is like electricity upon which other technologies are built and accelerated. So I think that is where the urgency is coming in, is that how AI can power other fields and make it a highly consequential potential.
Thank you very much. Any last question? One last question, yeah. I think we have time for that. Microphone over there, please. Or just shout loudly.
Yes, yes.
Don't get up, Bo. Don't worry about it. It's really...
Much slower than that. So maybe not a quick question, but to play the devil's advocate.
Could you identify yourself, please?
Yeah, Josh Wirth. I'm head of IP for Enride, a Swedish company. To play devil's advocate, maybe not my personal opinion here, but Andre, when you started, you said that intellectual property is often misunderstood because people don't consider it to be property. And I think when we look at national security implications, we see that countries have regularly taken property from foreign countries, from foreign nationals, be it real estate, be it money, other assets. But it seems like you're advocating for intellectual property to be treated differently in this case. So.
Interesting, clever. Look, these are all complicated issues with lots of nuances, but the reality is that at the highest levels, intellectual property is property and has the attributes of property and should be treated as property. Obviously, there are some differences, right? But I can debate even your premise, which I don't want to. I just want to point out how legislators don't really think of IP as pure property. For example, the Europeans want to have a rate-setting board for patents that are related to standards. Okay, should there be a rate-setting board for, gold? Should there be a rate-setting board for, for other products or other tangible property? How about having a rate-setting board for the implementers of the IP? Maybe we should have a rate-setting board for laptops or for cell phones. Nobody even in the West, it doesn't even cross your mind to do such a things. We're not going to have a rate-setting board for almost any type of property. Whether it's your watch or again gold or whatever it might be. But here they don't have an issue with this, and to even have the conversation. And that's true in many other examples. With respect to having minimum standards for the rule of law, you have to be careful when you are, if you are taking certain personal property, whether bank accounts of terrorist states or the like, obviously you have to keep in mind what consequences that might have. That is very, very different from the type of embargoes that we're talking about when it comes to technology at mass scale. We're not talking here about patents from, I don't know, North Korea, for example, or whatever. The real thing that's meaningful here is patents that enable innovation in the West versus innovation in the East at the high level, at the global level, and how they should be treated. And it remains my view that it's really important to have a non-discriminatory approach.
Thank you very much. And on that point, we've run out of time. Clearly, there are some potential downsides, worst-case scenarios, if the trade war did become worse and the damage to the IP system in general. But I'd like to thank the panel for giving a very optimistic five-year view of where we're likely to be. Thank you very much.